No one will fix all that ails this world, right? This is not, it's much too big an ask to put on philanthropy, much less government, right?
Listening to the needs of the people you hope to serve is always going to lead to a better solution.
Now, the truth is, though, philanthropy is not going to fill the gap. There is never enough money to do all that is needed. And so you have to make some hard decisions.
You don't necessarily have to wait until a disaster happens. You can analyze and think about your own response and help communities to prepare.
We need to see that this is a moment for us to stand firm to our principles, our values, and continue to hold the truths of caring for communities and all that we've kind of set out and done.
I'm Brandolon Barnett, and welcome to Guide to Good. I'm excited to be in conversation today with Patty McIlreavy, CEO and president of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Welcome, Patty.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course, and thank you for joining us. Why don't we start with just a little bit about yourself, how you got into the space of disaster philanthropy and the work that you do, as well as the Center for Disaster Philanthropy and its mission.
Great, thanks. So let me start with the CDP first. So the Center for Disaster Philanthropy is the only philanthropy-serving organization that guides donors towards equitable recovery after disaster. We do that in a number of ways. We do it through education, we do it through expert advisory services, and we do it through standing up funds as a service to philanthropy of how they can practice the behavior which we seek to model of equitable giving towards community-led recovery after disaster. A little bit about me. I joined CDP about 5 years ago, and I joined CDP from a history of having worked both, operationally and also on the policy space in the humanitarian sector internationally, and really looking at all that we can do to be more effective, how important it is to really let communities guide and lead their own recovery. And that, CDP just drew me as a way to say, okay, I've been on the doing side of this work. Now I can be on the kind of influencing funding side and try and help people model the behavior that actually I believe will make a big difference as we move forward as a global community.
Yeah, and you joined at the height of COVID, right? Which must have been quite a welcome.
It was different. I mean, luckily CDP was already a remote organization. So while we've changed a lot since then, and also I think recognize that the way we did remote as a smaller organization doesn't necessarily serve as we go larger. But I think it was a great moment in a sense for my leadership, because I came from that space and I was able to really say to people, hey, this isn't going to be a simple matter of a vaccine and some protective equipment. We really need to look at how this is going to ripple through our communities in so many ways. And I was really proud to be, at CDP at a moment where we were able to help philanthropy lean in looking at how they could give differently, how they could open their aperture to the needs of their communities, and really be, just letting the community lead. Because I think, you will have seen this, Brandolon, when everyone, even your neighbors, we all had a different need to get out of that pandemic beyond the vaccine. And that really reinforced CDP's story. We're able to talk now about how disasters are an experiential equalizer, but only to a certain level, right? We all are feeling the same event, but our vulnerabilities to that event are vastly different. And how we recover will be dependent on our vulnerabilities, not the event alone.
Yes, and I know, I know that you and CDP both have a view that really there's all of these wide-reaching consequences for disaster. It's not really a kind of, I would say, a linear event, as many people think of it. There's a disaster, you go in and there's a recovery effort. It's really a lot more complicated than that. I would say we built our Guide to Good to be a platform that people can trust, where they want to learn about issues, find nonprofits, track and measure their giving, and make a difference in their community. And I know I wanted to put it to the test. So I'm curious if you can help test its capabilities as well. We actually asked it specifically to tell you the thoughts on the concept of every donor being a disaster donor, and how they can help to deal with the really multifaceted issues that arise after disaster. And its response was that The idea that every donor is a disaster donor highlights the interconnectedness of various social issues and the impact of disasters on all areas of philanthropy. Essentially, it suggests that regardless of a donor's primary focus, be it education, health, or the environment, disasters can disrupt these sectors and create urgent needs that require attention and funding. So my question for you is what we have created sort of communicating that concept correctly? And tell us a little bit more about this idea of every donor being a disaster donor and all of these ripple effects that happen after a disaster.
Yeah, I'm a little worried you guys are going to put us out of business with that. I think that was a quite good definition. Really trying to really break down what is a disaster, because you have to understand what a disaster is to really understand, am I a donor to a disaster? And a disaster is an event meeting a vulnerability. And when you really look at it that simply, and some may say, oh, that's an oversimplification. But the reason we present it that way is to help people get to that path of how do people recover from this event? Because what is their vulnerability? Why were they vulnerable to begin with, right? So when we say everyone's a disaster donor, it's because if you're actually investing in education, if you're investing in social justice, if you're investing in economic recovery, any of those investments decrease vulnerabilities of people to events that are coming. And those events may be very personal, right? Which are not necessarily, a disaster is personal. It might be a disaster to me, but nobody else notices, right? So it may be helping people with those small scale disasters, but it also may be helping with those larger events that are coming. So even then we look at a hurricane and we say a hurricane meets vulnerabilities is a disaster. But we actually at CDP take it even deeper than that, Brandolon. We look at what is a hurricane. A hurricane is multiple events. A hurricane is a windstorm. It is storm surge. It is inland flooding. It is tornadoes. And looking at each of those categories of events helps you see what are the vulnerabilities people are susceptible to, from those events, and what then might their recovery be. So for example, the recovery to Hurricane Helene last year looks very different in Florida, where I live, and where we had storm surge and inland flooding and tornadoes and high wind in different ways, but not on a massive, massive scale in terms of what they had in North Carolina with inland flooding, right? And so what do you do? How do you address those differences? What were the vulnerabilities specific to North Carolina that made their situation so drastically different than here? Well, one of it is they had a mountainous terrain, right? And they had a lot of rain in advance, right? So the vulnerabilities are sometimes systemic, sometimes they are in advance. They're things that have been man-made and created in terms of poverty or, racial inequities. But sometimes it's just something as simple as topography and the climate and what's occurred in the weather patterns. And so we're trying to really look at asking donors, back up, open up your aperture a bit. Look at the fullness of the event, look at the scale of the vulnerability, and put those together. And when then you're looking at how do I help this community, you will see that plastic sheeting, warm meals only go so far, because the vulnerability to fix it, to remedy it, to recover from it, to go further from it, to thrive as a community needs more than what we look at in the response phase. It needs, business loans. It needs small business loans. It needs strapping of roofs, replacement of roofs. It might need investments in the infrastructure in the area to allow people to get to their jobs because their vehicles were damaged, whatever it may be. It allows us to look much more broadly at how does this community advance beyond this. And so if you're looking at this as a donor, whatever you might care, if you care about that community, and helping that community advance and grow, you are decreasing their vulnerabilities. You are mitigating their, responsiveness or their vulnerabilities. And in doing that, in our opinion, you're a disaster funder. And I don't mind if you call yourself that. I thank you for doing it. And I appreciate that for those communities, whether or not they will ever know you've helped them in that way specifically, shouldn't matter as much as what we've done has actually helped.
And I really love that. It's so much more of an expansive view of how we can engage after disaster than the sort of immediate need. I've heard it called truck and chuck giving. Whereas, for example, I believe in supporting small minority-owned businesses. So I might, for example, after disaster, support a local CDFI, which can put money into local small businesses. It is a way more expansive view of how we can help. But how, as a donor, can I sort through all of the different ways that I can engage? Because it is more expansive, but that also means there are now a lot more things that I need to think about when I'm looking to support after a disaster. How do I wade throughout all of that if I'm a donor?
Well, I think one of the biggest ways to help after to know how to help after a disaster is to think about it before. Right? So what are the events to which the communities or the programs or the sectors you care about vulnerable? And really, it's the same as you would do with any other strategy as a donor. What is my giving strategy? What aligns with my mission, my vision, what communities I care about? Are there organizations I have pre-vetted that I might want to reinforce and support and help them, explore how they would respond to a disaster if it hit my community, our community, or the community I care about, whichever way it may be, right? So I think these are things that, to really look at in terms of how to help. I mean, I think the most important thing is to give yourself grace. I mean, no one will fix all that ails this world, right? It's much too big an ask to put on philanthropy, much less government, right? It takes all of us together to advance the development, our common development, our common future. And so when you're looking at how do I help, really look at asking yourself some of those questions where, what are the types of ways I give? Can I give through, time, talent, treasure, right? Are there different ways I can be supporting this organization? What aligns to, do I want to give in relief? Do I want to give in recovery? Do I want to find organizations that do different types of activities? These are all things that at CDP we really encourage, and we've got resources to help people with this, this thinking. But it starts with recognizing no one is looking to you to solve it all, and instead, what can you do? But let me talk just a little bit more, Brandolon, about the no one is looking to you to solve it all, because I think there's another mistake or challenge we make in philanthropic giving, or even donors do this, is we center ourselves, right? It's about, what have I done? What is the impact I have achieved for you, with you? And that doesn't center communities. That doesn't give them the dignity and agency of choice. That's about me. And I get there's some, reverberation of good feeling from giving. It's in the World Happiness Report, right? They said giving is actually a way to feel better, to be happier. So I recognize that that's a huge driver, but we don't have to be the ones with solutions. I have over, dating myself, 30 years experience working in this sector. And every day I will learn something new, because I'm not of every culture. I'm not of every experience. I'm not of every, town, village, whatever it might be. We all bring different things into it. And what we need then to recover from a disaster is going to depend on your specific vulnerabilities, your specific experiences. And so we need to always be open to centering that community, to centering their thinking, their solutions, and being open to hearing that and recognizing we may not know it. It's also about being okay with not having closure. Everything, if you look at recovery, you can't guarantee that there was a major impact that had a long-standing, even a response, right? You can't guarantee that it's going to make a big difference. You're not going to be able to solve the famine in Sudan by giving a few $1,000s. You're not going to be able to solve the needs of North Carolina by giving a few $1,000s, but you will. Together, we all giving our funds, by all of us contributing, we are helping. And who knows, those people we're helping, they may be the ones who come up with the solutions to fix, what ails their community, right? So it's about trying to be open to identifying that the solutions are bigger than us and we're part of it. We are not it. And part of that's about recognizing, why am I giving, right? And how to ensure that we're making that space, and also just giving creatively, as I said, like really allowing people to lead us in creative ways towards programming. Yes, of course, there's ideas, there's certain through lines, but what might be other ways that this community might find their way out of this disaster, and that we may not have thought of because we're not within that community ourselves.
Yeah, and it strikes me that that's the way that you build anything worthwhile, right? Listening. whether it's a product or a service or a program, listening to the needs of the people you hope to serve is always going to lead to a better solution. So I love the idea of thinking about disaster philanthropy specifically through that lens. We can't talk about disaster philanthropy in the current climate without addressing recent changes in federal funding and foreign aid, which may be creating gaps in recovery funding and response. How are you and CDP thinking about the impact of those changes, and how can individuals in particular think about stepping in to address any gaps that you think may begin to appear? I know that's a big question.
Yeah, no, it's a huge question, and one that troubles us greatly, right? I mean, I think that the recent changes in federal funding and foreign aid, and even those that are kind of being foreshadowed as coming, for example, changes to FEMA. I think first and foremost, what CDP's position is we understand reform, right? We understand that there are needs for reviewing how funding is spent, reviewing to make sure it's as effective and efficient. It's where I started off our conversation. Is a large part of my career has been for driving for efficiencies. There is never enough money to do all that is needed. And so you have to make some hard decisions. And we recognize that at CDP. But what we're seeing in the way it's being done right now, it's the needs are really drastically increasing, right? There just is a huge gap occurring that is, bigger than even the U.S.'s withdrawal. There's been withdrawals from other countries as well, right? So I mean, there's just a lot happening at one time in terms of a perfect storm. While we're also seeing conflicts and disasters from natural events increasing, right? So I mean, we have this really complicated moment of a withdrawal while there's increasing needs, and those gaps are causing health services, housing, education, climate resilience, and beyond to just kind of falter, to trip, to stop, right? And that's a major concern for us. Now, the truth is, though, for this audience, is philanthropy is not going to fill the gap. And we need to be honest with ourselves about that. It's, the work of a global society, the work of a global caring society, it takes us all. It takes governments at every level, from federal to state to, local. They all need to be involved. We need philanthropy in of course, its many dimensions, which is corporate and private and community and individuals. We should never underestimate the individuals and their giving. But it takes all of us together to help these communities. And that's where we're seeing some challenges, is how do we continue this? And how do we not make it one, this myth that one part can fill the gap of another, right? So that's just something we have to recognize. The outpacing of resources to needs to resources is something we grapple with all the time pre these current changes. I mean, I used to talk with my team. We would say, oh, well, so much of the funding that goes into disasters is for relief, and we want more of it to go to recovery, and we want some to go to preparedness. And I was like, why are we fighting over the pie? I just want more pie. Like, we need to have more money come in. So what philanthropy can do is look at giving more to communities that are vulnerable to disasters. Look at giving more to communities that are vulnerable, period. What they already are giving, do you have organizations you already support? Give more to them and help give funding that allows them to be sustaining, right? So don't have everything be a pass-through to the impact you want to have. Recognize that you want to invest in that civil society as well. Recognize that you want a vibrant organization that's there for the community, from the community, and so we have to work differently. And again, this is something we're going to have to look at. We're going to have to look at working more collaboratively, really recognizing that it's going to take a lot of us working in different ways, more equitably. We can't plug every hole, but are there ways we can have strategic interventions that allow system strengthening, that center local actors, that unlock or complement other sources of support, right? Are there ways we can bring in other money? I always think about during COVID, how the Ford Foundation did that bond, right, where they took out I think it was $100 million bond against some of their endowment. Thank you. To allow them to actually do more, right? So I mean, creativity. Look for this. Bring drawing down more of your DAFs. So it's definitely we need to be exploring how we're doing more, and really in some ways we have to. At the current moment, Brandolon, we can get very paralyzed by the intent behind the changes, or what we perceive as the intent behind the changes. We can get paralyzed by the incredible, massive needs that are now happening as a result of that. And that's fine. We have to have that. That's a human nature. But we also need to rally. And we need to see that this is a moment for us to stand firm to our principles, our values, and continue to hold the truths, of caring for communities and all that we've kind of set out and done for decades in terms of the change we want to see, holding to it. And part of that is going to be on disasters. It's going to be on vulnerabilities, because I think we're going to see more disasters happening. That is not a result of these actions. That is a result of other actions, other inactions. But we are going to see more occurring, at which point, it's going to be even more important that we are prepared to be there together for communities.
Yeah. And I think for our audience and those listening, watching, can you share an example of all of this done right? Community-driven solutions, support that is not just reactionary, but actually in anticipation and providing some assistance to preparing for disasters so that they are not as harmful to the communities that they affect. Do you have any really good examples, or one example that you'd like to share?
For preparedness, one of the biggest challenges we've found for preparedness, not just CDP, but anyone working in this sector, is that it's very hard to get funding for preparedness, because it's really hard to put your name against something that didn't happen, right? There's no log frame that can prove, something that doesn't occur. And so it is
similar phenomenon to preventive healthcare, for example.
Exactly. It's exactly the same. We all know, academically, like, yes, of course, if we have these things in place, that won't occur. But getting funding for that is harder, because it's just more difficult to be able to do it. But it is there's a lot of success through it. And there's many examples of where preparedness activities have actually resulted in lives saved. But it is a more complicated space in which to get funding, because, of course, like exactly your perfect example, health prevention, right? It's hard to get people to fund that which we have then stopped from happening. So, but in terms of a great case study of disaster, philanthropic recovery, right? Philanthropy focused and funding disaster recovery. I can't use a better example than right now is that the Truist Foundation has a heavy interest in Western North Carolina. They've made a very big commitment to North Carolina, which is where they are based as a foundation and as a bank. And through this big, hundreds of millions of dollars commitment, one of the things they've done is they've given CDP, $21 million to invest in Western North Carolina for recovery needs of that community. And so really looking at, we know this is going to take time. We know that the needs of this community are going to be different than what was provided 6 months ago when Hurricane Helene first hit. And we're in this for the long haul with this community we care about, this community that provides us our home as a bank and a foundation. And I think it's really been an amazing partnership, because it shows not just a willingness to put the investment in the space, it shows a willingness to also recognize that recovery doesn't look like, as you mentioned, the truck and chuck, right? It's recognizing that it's small business support, it's housing support, it's looking at items like disaster case management, right? We make it, it sounds like, you look at a disaster and it always seems like, okay, it's easy to get the funding that you deserve from your county, from your state, from the federal government, but it's actually not. Often you need a lot of documentation, some of which people don't have for whatever reason, or because it was destroyed in the actual event, or they're going through trauma and they can't, the forms, let's be honest, if you've ever tried to fill in one of these forms, they are difficult to fill in on your best days. They're almost impossible to fill in on your worst days. And so, having a philanthropic entity recognize that there was a need for this sustained support to their community and to put an investment into it through CDP is, for me, a perfect example of the collaboration I was referring to earlier, right? Just looking at, it's not any one of us that is going to make the solutions come forward for communities to allow them to thrive after, right? We talk about, we're not looking just for survive. We want communities to thrive. We want them to come out of this better than they were before, if possible. Often, it's the opposite that's true. People never even reach where they were in advance of the event affecting them. There are still people displaced in this country from Katrina. So, that is something they have never recovered from. And so how do we change that? How do we shift that? And part of that is we shift the narrative. We say it's not enough to, do the immediate response. It's important. Don't get me wrong. It's incredibly important, but it's not enough. Communities and affected individuals need us to look at that longer arc of their recovery and to be partners with them through it.
Yeah. And so we've touched on this idea that every donor rather can be a disaster donor, kind of thinking about issues more holistically, this sort of increase in frequency and intensity of disasters, a rapidly changing regulatory landscape. There seems to be this sort of maelstrom of different factors causing a rethink or an evolution, including preparedness, of how people are addressing these issues. When you put all of that together, how are you thinking about how it all influences the future of disaster philanthropy? For example, we've seen with recent disasters an increase in giving directly to individuals through a lot of the platforms that have arisen. What other changes do you see coming, and what is your position on those changes, and which we should be excited for and which we should be cautious about if we're looking to support different communities following a disaster or in preparing for disaster?
As I said, just start off with it. There's never enough. So I love that people are coming up with new ideas and figuring out how to help. But a caution I would have is disasters people are at their most vulnerable. They've been vulnerable to the event, and now they're vulnerable to abuse. And so we have to be attentive to if someone is giving you a solution that seems so simple and so easy, and no one's doing it, and they're the first to think of it, I would say question that. Because chances are it has been tried, and maybe there's a new change. Things change. You try it again, you try it again, you try it again. What is it? Venture capitalists only invest in something after it's failed 6 times, right? So sometimes you do have to do it multiple times. But if it's seemingly the solution is a GoFundMe that no one else can possibly do, I'd say do your research. That said, I am excited about a lot of the changes and challenges that are coming to the system. I like that we're looking a lot more at locally led response and recovery through community organizations. I think in the past, there's always been a little bit of a hesitation for that. I prefer to go with the organization I've heard of, the household name. Well, that's not necessarily going to get you the best impact at the level of the organization. Scale, yes, definitely scale. Getting into places that are very insecure or very complicated or complex, absolutely. But getting into your local community or the town over where they've had a flood, maybe not, right? I think being really open to the fact that those who know the community who look like, sound like, understand the culture, they often are going to have programming that's much richer and deeper with that community. And that's just a reality. And so finding them and funding them is relatively new, because people have been hesitant to do it in the past. But I think that is wonderful that that's happening. And I really encourage that and explore that. There is a certain tipping point to be cautious of, really keep an eye on, don't drown someone with your good intent, in that they may be not have the system set up to go as far as you'd like them to go, as fast as you'd like them. So fund their infrastructure. And a lot of small organizations they'll be hesitant to ask you to fund that, because they're going to be like, they've been on maybe a bit of a starvation diet for their funding. Right now, you're coming in with a big grant to have them do something. But remember, they need to invest in themselves. They need to build themselves to have success. So be open to that. Really be flexible as much as possible. Actually, be flexible in your funding overall. Let them guide the funding and where it goes. I think cash directly to individuals is a great initiative that is getting a lot more success at the moment. And here by success, I don't mean it wasn't successful in the past. I think there is more willingness from donors to fund direct cash support. And here again, Brandolon, we have to fight myths. People have this assumption that because I'm disaster affected, I'm untrustworthy. I don't know what to do with the money. I'm going to do the wrong things with the money. I'm just going to say, remind yourself that's centering you in their decisions, right? And they will make, why do we have this assumption that people who've been affected by a disaster care less about their children, care less about their health care, care less about their jobs, right? We need to recognize that people, the cash programming allows them to choose where the gaps in their assistance and needs are. So for example, let's say I am a disaster affected individual and I get funding for my roof. Directly, someone's going to fund my roof. And you come to me and you say, well, here's money for your roof. I don't want money for my roof. I have my roof covered. But what I need money for is the mold remediation, or fixing my car, which also got damaged in the flood, or whatever it may be. And by you giving me it as cash, I get to make a decision, where is the gap that I need to plug right now at this moment. And it might change next month. My gap might be different because I might have a different need. I might have family that helped me in a certain way. So I think those kind of things, really looking at lifting up communities and giving them the dignity of choice. And I feel, it's a space we haven't told the story of well enough, right? Why do people give? They give because of proximity. They give because of scale, and they give because of media, right? And empathy, of course, wrapping around all of those things. And what we try and do, at CDP, is to remind people that by letting people have choice in how they move forward and giving them that dignity, having that longer arc of looking at their needs, we are actually furthering the assistance you've given and taking it to them having the choices in what they might need, how they might need it. And that's just a really important part of the narrative we need to tell better. When we look at why people give, it ties to also the stories we've told, right? It's muscle memory. I've been told to give in this way for this need. We need to remind people that people who are survivors of disasters need us to see them as people, need us to see them as people who have the ability to take responsibility for their future. And I will say, I think as a community, we haven't told that story well enough. We haven't lifted people's stories up in terms of what they've done for themselves. We have all too often painted affected communities as passive recipients versus active responders.
Yeah, well, that's a powerful point. And what you're really speaking to is the idea of a shift in mindset, not only about finding a disaster, but about thinking about the factors that could exacerbate a disaster once it happens. So that preparedness factor, but also shifting your mindset in terms of thinking more bottoms up in terms of what a community needs and how it can respond, and how it can respond and how it can lead that response. That mindset shift can be difficult, right? So if you I want to end with just some practical ideas and advice for any donors that are hearing this and thinking, how can I actively engage in that mindset shift? And for the person out there thinking that, what might be the first step you'd advise them to take today to begin to adopt this shift in mindset?
Well, I think self-awareness. I think, really, turning a lens back on ourselves at times and say, is my giving driven? Is there an imbalance in my drivers for my giving? Do I believe I know more than those who happen to live in a place where they were hit by an event, right? I think that, again, it's this narrative we have. We like, as a society, this isn't just the United States, this is globally. I've seen this everywhere. We victim blame, right? It's somehow their fault that they're in this situation. Well, I mean, my hope was coming out of COVID that we would all be like, actually, it's nobody's fault, right? Like this, sometimes things just happen. Sometimes sometimes there are reasons why that person is vulnerable to that crisis, right? And that vulnerability, again, is sometimes systems. It's created. It's not necessarily within their power to have altered that. And so we shouldn't have it that we have a mindset that you have to be wealthy to live on the coast because of the risk of hurricanes. And so you have to build a house that's hurricane proof. We shouldn't have a mindset that if someone's on a floodplain, somehow they should have been smarter than to buy in a floodplain, because floodplains change based on other developmental factors and infrastructure. We shouldn't, these things that we tell ourselves, narratives that somehow are positioning us to be able to walk away, right? And so for me, self-reflection, self-awareness. Have I done that? Do I do that? Have I ever thought that? And then again, I'm not saying you condemn yourself. I'm saying you make a promise to think differently. You say, next time I hear this, I'm gonna listen a little longer. I'm gonna explore what else might be underlying this issue. Why might this community have been at risk? Are there factors beyond their control that led them to be vulnerable to this event? And what then can I do to help buffer them in the future, to help them recover and address that vulnerability? And that vulnerability may be at that community level, but it may be nationwide, it may be globally, right? I mean, some systemic inequities are not, necessarily they're not in one community alone. We all know that, right? So how do we address that together? And so really reflecting on that as a donor, because then once I do that, I'm a more generous donor, both in my time, talent, and treasure, but I'm also a more generous donor in my mindset, in thinking through what people may need to help them get out of this, in allowing them to be the center of their own recovery, because I'm no longer feeling that they need me to tell them what they've done wrong or why this happened to them. I am instead in a position of listening, understanding, empathizing, and following their lead. And that's, for me, like the first step. Of course, you can have strategies. I mean, there's a whole lot of systems I can give you in terms of, review your values, look at where they align with other organizations. Those are all very important things. But the first step really is starting with ourselves.
I think that's great advice. And it's great advice for disasters, but also across a wide array of issues, probably. Thank you so much for the conversation today. This has been a conversation as part of our Guide to Good series at Giving Compass with Patty McIlreavy, CEO and President of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Thank you for joining us, Patty. I think this has been some great insights into how folks can think about supporting disasters. And I think one of the key takeaways is you don't necessarily have to wait until a disaster happens. You can analyze and think about your own response and help communities to prepare, which I think is a great takeaway. But thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me, and appreciate all you do to raise awareness on this issue and many others across your work.
Thank you.